Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Lessons in Leadership, the podcast brought to you by MLK Search with a mission to provide more knowledge and understanding around leadership recruitment within education. My name's Steve Lyons, and today we're going to be digging into our guest background and journey into school leadership, as well as his top tips for any would-be leaders and his views on any current leadership landscape when it comes down to recruitment. Today, I'm honoured to be joined by Stephen Tierney. Stephen's the former CEO of the Blessed Edward Bamber Catholic Multi-Academy Trust and was the chair of the Head Teachers Roundtable for 7 years from 2014 to 2021. Starting off as a science teacher, Stephen eventually became an executive head of 2 Catholic schools, which formed the basis of the trust he then became CEO of. Since moving away as the CEO in 2019, Stephen still engages with schools and school leaders as a speaker, author and tutor for the National College of Education Senior Leaders Masters Programmes. An author of multiple leadership books, his latest being Leadership, Being, Knowing and Doing, Steve's got a wealth of experience around school leadership and is still a key figure within the school leadership education space. Stephen, I'm honoured to have you on. I knew about you way before you knew I existed, so I'm really excited to get you on the podcast today and just find out more about yourself and really share the knowledge and wealth of experience that you've got. Steve, if we start off with the first question, just really about your background, sort of where you grew up and really why you decided to get into teaching in the first place, that'd be great.
So I was born in Southport, grew up in Southport, so went to local kind of primary schools there and then into the secondary school and sixth form at Christ the King, and then on to university. And if I'm honest, it's one of those things, I have never actually set out to be a teacher. I actually wanted to be a doctor, wow. Is what I did. So I did kind of my A levels, physics, chemistry and biology. Didn't quite get the grades I needed, so I resat the year. Second year, I got the grades I needed first year for medicine, but not the grades I needed second year for medicine. And I always wonder. I went for an interview at Liverpool University for medicine, and the guy walked me round and took me into a post-mortem at the time. So kind of there's a body there, and it's all kind of splayed out. And I wondered whether he was just kind of looking to see, does this guy pass out? He'd ask me questions, and I knew. And at the end of the interview, he said to me, right, what grades would you like me to offer you? And I wonder what he would have said if I went 2 E's, because I would have gone in easily with 2 E's. But I thought I went for a reasonable medical offer and missed it by a grade. So I decided then to go on to university. I actually went to Liverpool University and I studied pharmacology. It was kind of medical related, lots of interest around kind of the body, physiology, impact of drugs and that kind of thing. So it kind of was in a similar field. And by third year, I'm thrashing around thinking, what the hell am I going to do? And mum and dad, when they got married, dad was a draftsman, mum was a secretary. Well, they actually both trained to be teachers, dad in FE and mum actually ended up working in special schools in Liverpool. So they didn't start as teachers, they trained later in life. And mum said to me, and I can still remember, she said, well, why don't you think about teaching? And my response to it, and it's kind of lived with and haunted me ever since, was no, I can't do teaching. It's too easy. I need something that challenges me. And so that's kind of, I've lived to regret that statement over the years. But it started off, and then I applied to get into teaching. I got offered places, and I found the classroom quite a natural place for me. It kind of worked, and I kind of seemed to work well with teenagers, young people. I was quite sporty, so I got engaged with sports, and that always got you credibility a little bit. I liked teaching chemistry, and so it kind of flowed from there. So it was almost by accident I ended up in teaching, but then found myself in quite a natural environment. You know, this was my habitat. I could live here quite happily. So that's how I got in. Accidents.
Wow. And where was your first post then, Stephen? So obviously you did the training. And where did you get your first job?
My first job was in Blackburn at a place called Notre Dame, and nothing to do with me, but it was knocked down after I'd been there a year. Right. So I kind of realised when I went into the job, but it never struck me, it never bothered me, that the school was amalgamating, which meant nothing. So 2 schools were coming together as one. So I started off at Notre Dame in Blackburn, and then that amalgamated into Our Lady in St John, and it was kind of really quite an interesting time and place, because it was 50% kind of white working class Blackburn and 50% kind of working class Muslim in Blackburn as well. And it gave me a real different flavour to anything I experienced before, quite multicultural in terms of multi-faith. And it was at a time, you know, Salman Rushdie and Satanic Verses, so a lot of kind of issues were coming out within the community, and people were talking. And so that was kind of the first place I started teaching. And I stayed there for, I'm trying to think, about 7 or 8 years.
Wow.
Before I moved on, got various promotions within the school.
Yeah. So in terms of, you know, those promotions and then deciding to move into school leadership, was that something you always wanted to do, Stephen? Was it, you know, I want to be a head teacher eventually, I want to be a deputy head, or did you naturally just go through there? Sort of, how did you get into leadership, and what were those initial learning curves, those major learning curves when you eventually went into leadership?
I don't know whether I kind of thought about it, but I used to get ribbed a little bit at Notre Dame and Our Lady in St. John, really nicely. And some of the staff said, "Oh, we always knew you'd be a head teacher," and that they kind of did there. And I've no idea why, because it's not something I set out. But you know, I kind of turned up, and I'd been teaching PE, so I you know, sometimes then would appear up on my PE on my timetable, and so I turned up to interview in my PE kit, asked where the loo was, and went to change into my suit. And I don't know whether that to me just seemed a natural thing to do. Go and do your lesson and then go off for the interview in the afternoon. And I just changed there and then, or whether people saw that as, I don't know, some kind of confidence, or whether they were a little bit with hindsight. But there was always a sense of, I kind of get frustrated because I want to influence more what was happening. So I really enjoyed teaching. I liked kind of the classroom engagement. I liked the subject I was teaching, but I kind of always wanted to influence it a little bit more. And so I was kind of really looking out to the amalgamation, which is normally quite a bruising process, because if you think you've got 2 heads, a number of deputies, a number of heads of science, heads of history, heads of geography, only one person gets the job. So normally it's a bit of a damaging affair, but I actually got a promotion out of it. So my first promotion was 8 weeks into teaching for the following September.
Wow.
And it allowed me to take a bit more responsibility for the curriculum. And what I found out very early on is I was really, really good with the tasks. So if there's a job to do, I could get the job done.
Yeah.
What I didn't always see clearly enough was the people and how I engaged people. And so kind of, I think one of the real kind of learning curves for me, and one of the, if you like, the challenges was not to just simply get the job done on my own, but actually work with people to get the job done. And you learn that actually, you know, if I'd stayed in the classroom for my full teaching career, I might have got 30, 35 years in. You get a group of 5 or 6 people around the table, and sometimes you can have 100 years of teaching experience. Yeah. And a series of different perspectives, and that kind of experience plays in and enriches what you do and challenges what you do and brings kind of nuance to the teaching of their learning into what you're doing. So I think that was one of the early lessons, and one that kind of stayed with me, that kind of so much leadership work is actually people work. Yeah. And that I suppose was one of the biggest takeaways I had on early on.
And do you think that's, you know, learning that quite early on in sort of within a leadership aspect, is that something that you then carried throughout your leadership career, Stephen?
Yeah, but what happens kind of as you become a leader of larger and larger, tend to be groups and areas of responsibility. You get to the point where you realise, A, you can't do it on your own. It's just too big. B, it will actually be a poorer outcome if you try and do it on your own. And so how do we now engage staff? And sometimes there's challenges in the thinking. And you've got to let go of what you knew before. So if I take assessment as a simple example in education, when I became a deputy, I was responsible for assessment. And the first thing I did was I introduced everything I'd learned about assessment in science into the whole school policy. But English is different to science, and so is history, and to an element maths is as well, and geography and PE and drama. And so by trying to bring the science knowledge in, actually you didn't show enough distinction for other subjects and how they learned and why assessment was important in there. So you almost had to let go of that and start going back to fundamental principles. And sometimes, you weren't grounded well enough in those principles, so you had to go away and learn. So that kind of idea of the ability to balance both the tasks and the people becomes critical, particularly as you become more senior, because your teams and areas of responsibility just get larger. So the people challenge becomes greater, and utilising their experience and their knowledge within their particular areas. Same can cut in primary. There's a big difference between teaching early years and teaching year 6.
Yeah, of course.
So it's that kind of phase of school.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously, Stephen, a lot of your career, particularly sort of as a teacher, as a leader, and then as a CEO as well, as sort of being within that Catholic education sector. How does that differ? Because obviously we will have listeners to this podcast that might work in a Catholic school, might be considering working in a Catholic school. In terms of leadership within Catholic education and just in general, how does that differ, in your opinion, to non-faith mainstream schools, for example?
And there's a lot of similarities, first of all, but some of the ways of trying to explain differences, and they're always clumsy, but I sometimes talk about, as a leader, I was a storyteller, not a story writer. And when I expand that, what I kind of say to people is sometimes when you take responsibility for a school, say a community school, particularly if it doesn't have a long history and sense of tradition about from that school, then you have to kind of, this is what this school is about. This is our mission and our vision, and this is what we are going to do. So you have to write the story, tell the story, and then enact the story. The difference in Catholic education is that the story was written a couple of thousand years ago. The story's written. You're part of the mission of the church, if you like. So your work is sat within that greater set of work. And so you're much more of a storyteller. You're not writing the story. And so, there were things about the importance of service within the school, about the school being part of civic society, but there were things about worship within the school that were important, and also that kind of element of what I might describe as proclaiming the distinctiveness, how we see Catholic education and how it influences all that we do within the school. And so that sense of mission within the church, and the fact that you've got to really understand the story that was written and tell it in your time and place, is, I think, the difference. You don't get to write the story.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. And obviously, I believe, if I'm correct in thinking, when you became CEO of the trust in Blackpool, at Blessed Edward Bamber, that was quite an early trust in that geographical area. I don't think there was many Catholic trusts around at that time. So, how was it stepping into suddenly becoming, an executive head teacher and then moving into a chief executive officer role within a Catholic, faith trust within that area? How did you find that?
It's interesting. I'm trying to. Somebody can probably, if they listen to the podcast, say, "Oh no, there was," but there's 4 dioceses in the northwest. And I think it was the only Catholic multi-academy trust at that time. And we're only going back to 2014, so it's not like 20 years ago. So first of all, I think there was kind of lots of worry around. Because they're doing something different and new. And a lot of leaders struggle with the elephant in the room, which is, right, so who's going to lead this trust? If you like, who's going to be my boss? And I don't want a boss, I want to be the head with my governing body. So there's something about the newness of it that I think was challenging. But it was part of a journey. So I really need to go back a decade. And the SSAT involved me in what was called a system redesign group. And it was a fantastic group to be a part of. Just about everybody else that was involved in the group is now a Sir or a Dame. And so I was kind of exposed to a level of thinking that I'd never seen, and people thinking quite radically and quite differently from across the country. And a guy called Dave Harris had set up an all-through school, so from 4 to 19. And I kind of fascinated with the idea, and Dave I just got on with as a person. So he invited me over to the school, and I can remember driving over and a couple of hour drive. And on the way I'm thinking, why would you do an all-through school? It just seems kind of problematic. And when you walked out about 6-7 hours later and you're driving home, you're thinking, why wouldn't you do all through? Why wouldn't you think about a child's journey through education from 4 to 19 and look to maximise the massive strengths that you find in primary and the massive strengths that you find in secondary, and make sure that we utilise them for the benefit of all? And so that started the journey. And I'd logged, right, there's something about all through here that's really working. And about 2007-8, the local Catholic primary school, Christ King, which is literally their field and our field and their kind of field, literally butted each other.
Yeah,
started to get into difficulty. So quite a few of our governors were shipped over to be governors at the school. And so they were saying, we come here and we do the work, and then we go, we do the same policy over there. And I'd get kind of emails, Steve, can you send us our policy on this? And do you mind if we change St. Mary's to Christ the King? Yeah, there's the policy, no problem. I've changed it for you, kind of thing. Simple thing to do. And we actually brought those two schools together with not a multi-academy trust, but what's called a hard federating. So it's one governing body.
Yeah.
Thinking about both schools, and we began to work together, though it kept quite separate. 2014, St. Cuthbert's fell out of favour with Ofsted is the best way to describe it. And so they had to become an academy, and the bishop only wanted multi-academy trusts. He didn't want single academy trusts, he wanted groups of schools. So we came together at the same time. There's a discussion for all the schools within Blackpool, the Catholic schools within Blackpool, about forming the trust. But they all fell away for different reasons. Just not interested very early on, had a look at it, but the head was about to retire, so they didn't want to make a major decision. Looked at it in detail, decided it was not for them. And so these three schools came together, and we really started working together we came together to work together, really started to work together quite profoundly on a lot of the curriculum work, which you go back a decade, I had seen and thought, this is great. And I think we did some really, really interesting stuff, supporting primary where they didn't have subject specialists, in terms of developing their curriculum from a subject perspective, supporting the secondary to make sure that the transition, they didn't repeat years 5 and 6 in year 7, and there's good continuity. And the leadership challenges came around, and again, it was a lot of the people stuff, about kind of their concerns, their worries, their hopes, their beliefs. What would this be about? How would it affect them? Little things like, can you tell me to go and teach at the other school? Well, arguably, yes, we could, but we wouldn't, because that'd just be a wind-up. So why do it? There's no purpose. Yet within 12 months of doing it, when we said, does anybody want to kind of teach at the other primary school, we had about 4 or 5 people saying, I quite fancy it. So we went from, you won't make me, will you, to, can I have a go?
Yeah.
And because the curriculums come together, they went from year 4 in one school to year 4 in the other, same thing they were teaching, just in a different environment that they quite liked. So yeah, it was good. I really enjoyed it. Odd job, but I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, and I mean, just there, you're talking about sort of almost changing the mindset of school leaders there, where it's, you're either going to force me to do this, or actually, no, I want to have a go at it, and being able to influence and change people's mindset, I think is really impressive. Yeah,
I mean, at the time, what was interesting at the time, just going back to part of the question as well, was because we were the only trust, people quite often used to come and visit me. You set up a trust. We're thinking of setting up a trust. And the question I always used to ask them was the simple one. Why are you doing it? Why are you setting up a trust? And the only answer I really ever got was, well, we thought we better do it, better jump before we were pushed. And that was just never a good enough reason. And so quite often sat behind people thinking about trusts, there was no why. They hadn't really thought through. So we had looked at it from the perspective of the work that we could do together over that educational journey. Yes, there were things in the support staff as well, bringing finance together, ICT together, HR support for each other, the kind of what they describe as the back office, but critical functions within any school and organisation. But we had some really strong reasons around education and what we could do that people have to think through.
Wow, it's great stuff. And obviously then, you've been CEO for quite a number of years. I think it was around 5 years. It sounds like around 5 years you were CEO of that trust. And obviously over that time, Steve, you've written books, a series of books, particularly around leadership within education. So why is it that you did that? Can you talk about your sort of literary expertise, I suppose.
It's strange. I always say I'm genuinely not the best writer. The last book, and I'll talk about that in a bit, but John Thompson literally had to kick me into shape as a writer. But it all started one Friday night. I don't know whether people know Ross Morrison McGill, Teacher Toolkit on Twitter. People might know. He phoned me on a Friday night and said, "Steve, do you fancy writing a book together?" Now, I'd done a bit of writing with Ross, and I knew what that meant. Ross would say, "Steve, I want you to write about this. I need this many words, and I need it by."
Yeah.
Right, I can do that. So this, I'm a scientist. I'm at 2,000 words on this topic, and I need it, within a fortnight. Great, I can do that. And for various reasons, Ross couldn't write the book together at that point. And John Catt kept saying, "Well, why not write one on your own?" And how many words? 40,000. I haven't got 40. I don't know 40,000 words. There's no chance. So I didn't. And then there's that kind of little thing. What happens if I write it and nobody buys it? Kind of thing. That's a big killer. And John Thompson got me over the line. He basically said, "Look, Steve, nobody's going to buy it. It's a book on educational leadership. It's really niche. So just be published and write what you want to write about." And so the first book is really quite personal in terms of it's quite descriptive of my journey, the first half of the book, including some parts which talk about, who I am, where I came from, which helps form and found you, and bits that mum and dad had written about themselves. Passages within there, which was lovely because I actually used them. I've read it at both of their funerals, and I used part of what they'd written about to tell their story through their own words. So it was quite a personal book, and then some kind of reflections towards the edge. I use the concept of bridges towards the edge, and so I talk about moving from informed to wise as one of the key things about making good decisions. And you can see in that book, which is, I say, is the more personal of the three in the first half, and then kind of has these three bridges at the end. Roots that came through. And the second book was called Educating with Purpose. So the first one's Liminal Leadership, Educating with Purpose. I never set out to write that book, but I wrote it through the first lockdown.
Right.
So what were you going to do in lockdown? Well, all right, I'll keep myself out of trouble. I'll keep myself, out of Cat's hair. I'll write a book. And I actually set off to write the last book. But when I started writing about purpose, there was just so much to write about that I thought it's got to form a book of its own. And part of my concern at the time was that purpose within education had become narrowed. But I don't think a lot of people could see how it become narrowed because they hadn't got the other perspectives of what education might look like.
Yeah.
And the danger of the narrowing isn't that we didn't do good things within, say, an area of cultural transmission. It was that we missed other things that I felt were also important, about citizenship, about that sense of civic and service, about kind of empowerment, which quite often when you look for disadvantaged young people, that sense of empowerment becomes important. So that book was kind of like an off-spin. And then I'd then got half of leadership being knowing, doing, written. And that was the book which is kind of purely leadership. And that was the one where John was saying, "Right, Steve, I think I've got a structure. Is it this?" And I was saying, yeah, that's kind of the structure. He said, "Well, you've got to make it clearer, and you've got to kind of refer to it and make sure that people are rooted within this really clear structure." And, having been kicked down the writing line by John a bit, you think, this is planning the whole book before you start writing. This is really good, and knowing what you're going to write. And it was a good experience. So that was the third book that came out.
And what are the key sort of themes of that third book then, Steve? Because that's your most recent, obviously. And
yeah.
So what are the key themes around that? Because obviously being, knowing, doing is quite, that hits quite hard as a title for a book. So what are the key themes within that in terms?
I suppose you go deep into what I believe education and education leadership should be about. And it's something, there's an old Greek word called phronesis, which is a type of wisdom. It's a practical wisdom. And it's about good character and good judgment. And to me, that starts to sum up this essence of what being a really good leader is. There's something about character. So there's something about who you are and who you bring, and what your purpose is, a sense of moral purpose, and a willingness to look, and I describe it as out of love, because it can be a hard thing, but to look deep within about who you are as a person, what you're good at, maybe what you're not so good at, where are you repeating kind of behaviors that help you be successful, and where you're repeating kind of failures, and doing something about them. So there's something about this about character. Then there's something about knowledge, because there's both specialist knowledge and strategic knowledge are the two areas that I talk about in the book. And that specialist knowledge of curriculum, that specialist knowledge in terms of teaching and learning and pastoral care, and that you need to know, because that's the major discourse. That's the conversation that goes on within schools. But there's something about strategy that I think at the minute is being pushed to one side that I think is important. And it's got two things. It's about enhanced knowledge. So things about, you've got to know about HR. You've got to know the basics. You might not be an HR expert, that's fine. You've got to know about finance. Otherwise, you're suddenly going to find you can't do what you want to do, and you're going to make some mistakes around finance. Sometimes you have to know about buildings. I mean, I went literally, and over my time as a head, I think I had well in excess of £30 million of public money.
Wow.
Spent on buildings. We can't waste that. It's important that you think, and that's where you engage with the experts, but you've got to have a sense of, this is what school is about. This is what education is about. So how can we create spaces that will help us do that? From very simple things like classrooms to what communal areas might look like and the rest. And then there's something beyond knowledge, because the beautiful thing about knowledge is I describe it as thinking as a low risk activity. So, think about the buildings. I could kind of draw, and why don't we have a school that looks like this? And then I can turn over the piece of paper, or we could have one that looks like this. And before you know it, in 10 minutes, I could have 5 different drawings, which have cost, what, a penny or so?
Yeah.
But when you move to doing, that's different.
Yeah.
And it's the ability of thinking deeply, but then in terms of your implementation, the practical, making it happen on the ground. Often ideas don't get converted because people are poor implementers. And he was thinking through implementation. It's thinking through kind of the networking, which is that people's bit. It's about that web of relationships that help you get things done. Thinking about guardianship, which was totally, I talk in the book about the fact that we need to look totally differently around accountability. And then thinking about developing of expertise. So I kind of structured the book around being, knowing, doing, and there's 8 elements across those 3 that I hope would help leaders think about their own work, their own leadership, their own practice.
Wow, that sounds amazing. And obviously, we'll be sharing a link with that when this podcast goes out. So hopefully people will have a good look at that and a good read, because it sounds amazing in terms of what it can help people achieve, really, in terms of support with their own leadership journey. Stephen, I wanted to speak a little bit about sort of leadership recruitment as well. Obviously we're a recruitment agency ourselves, so we see a lot of that from our side of things. But it's always great to get an example or some anecdotes around how your experience was as a candidate, so sort of interviewing for leadership roles, maybe deciding on which roles to go for, which ones you thought would be a best fit for you, and then what that process was like in terms of preparing, interviewing, securing a leadership role.
So I'm trying to think in terms of kind of full interviews, not kind of internal interviews, which were sometimes full experiences. But I only had one for teachers. So I got the first job I applied for, which kind of, there's an element of if you like, there's a bit of ability and there's a bit of luck. Your face kind of fits, you just fall into the right place. So that was straightforward. Afternoon, walk around the school, rock up in front of a panel of 5 or 6 people, sit and wait to get the decision. And then the next one I kind of went for was head of science. So I had some internal promotions, then head of science externally. And that was more of a 2-day process, but it followed a series of smaller interviews and then a full panel interview. And it's kind of interesting because at this point, nobody was asking you to teach. Yeah. So you kind of, it was by letter and application, references were taken up, and then you had some panel work. And then I had deputy interviews, and I had 2 for deputies. I didn't get the first one, and that's the one. I had 2 for headship as well, but that's the one where you look at I would have really loved to have got that. Yeah. It was the one, but I was just too naive. I think I did write myself as a bit of a rough diamond and really quite rough. So you'd have to have done a lot of polishing still to have found that deputy head underneath, and there was just somebody who was more ready. They were already a deputy. for it. But it was quite naive in terms of it was a 2-day interview. And I thought kind of the first morning we'd be kind of walking around, staff shaking hands, trying to be pleasant. And I kind of arrived and it was bang, bang, bang. I was through 3 panel interviews before I turned around.
Yeah.
And then I found out that they were then cutting the field down. Like nobody had told me they were cutting the field down. So that was it. Got the next job, which was a very similar process. Headship. And this is where it's worth looking because I had 2 interviews for headship. The first one I didn't get, and I got sent home at the end of day 1. And there's a second day. And they were dead right to send me home. I wouldn't have been the right candidate for them, and I would have hated the school. It just wasn't right. Whereas that first deputy interview, I think I would have really loved the school. I think it would have been right for me. But you could almost see me if I'd got the job within a year or two. I'd be kind of like, no, this is totally wrong. And the reason it's really hard to describe this to people, but there is a 2-way process. Quite often you're desperate to get the job, but you've got to get the job in the right place.
Yeah.
And you've got to make decisions about right place. The second interview was right place. And differently there, at the end of the first day, they sent everybody else home and just kept me.
Wow.
So it was kind of like, it was about right person, right place. And sometimes when you're going for jobs, this matching candidates don't do. And as a school, it's critically important that you have that, because if you bring somebody to school and the school's not right for them, they're going to soon know about it, and so will the organisation, and it's just not a good fit. Yeah. And so, just say to people, think about where you're applying. Even when you're desperate to get a job, it's got to be the right job for you.
Yeah, of course. And, that I suppose the recruitment process has been similar, across schools, across the country for quite a long time. Is there anything, from the hiring perspective then, Steve, because obviously you will have interviewed people to come and work in your own schools as well. Did you do anything different, or would you improve that process in any way, shape or form? Did you find anything that worked for you specifically that isn't necessarily always done by other schools or academy trusts?
I don't know, because I wouldn't know the kind of the widest brief of what people do. But when I kind of think back to what our process became, in some ways it sat around the being, knowing, doing.
Yeah.
And it didn't realise it at the time. But one of the things I would speak to every candidate. So I'd do a 10-15 minute interview with every candidate. And people kind of begin to know after a bit, particularly if they're internal. But I'd kind of be interested, Steve, talk to me about how you organise your wardrobe. And it's really interesting you'd have somebody who says, well, I haven't just got one wardrobe, I've got 2 wardrobes, and I organise, my winter and my summer clothes differently, and I had them kind of in colour across there. And they said, well, actually, I've got a 3rd wardrobe as well, where I keep, and there's other things that get, so it's hugely well organised. Yeah. Wardrobe. And then somebody else kind of said, I don't tend to have wardrobes. I just kind of pop the clothes in a pile at the end of the room and kind of pick off what I want for the day. And that was, and in essence, there was something about who they were as people that just fascinated me. So it's about how you drive. If you're on a motorway and there's going to be a kind of a blockage somewhere. And now you can sit on the motorway and it'll take you 30 minutes to get to where you're going, or there's a junction you can come off the motorway and then you can work your way around and keep driving, and it'll take you 30 minutes to get to where you're going. I.e., it makes no odds whether you stay on or come off in terms of time. Yeah. But you had people who I just sit on. I don't swap lanes. I just stay there. Other people, I'll be off. I can't sit. I've got to be. And there's something about who they were as people which fascinated me. Wow. And we do, particularly for teachers, we would give them subject papers, so examination papers in their own subject. Yeah. What's your knowledge like? So if you're a maths teacher, can you do the maths GCSE paper? And that was really interesting, because sometimes the answer was no, they couldn't. Wow. So really, really poor scores, which would hardly get them a grade. And then it never, the top mark wasn't always necessarily the person who got the job, and there's normally a group of people around the top, but it did kind of sort out people who didn't have particular knowledge we needed. And then interviews about what they were doing. And so you kind of had this being, knowing, doing without ever thinking about it like that. Something about their character, something about what knowledge they could bring, something about how they might do things, tested or assessed different ways through the day, including time for them to walk around. We always put them in the staff room at break. What does it feel like in here for you? Does it feel comfortable? Would you like to work in this place? always had a chat with the department or the team or whatever. So we try to kind of look at it from different perspectives, but I don't know whether there's anything particularly innovative there. Or different. There's just a bit of a structure which has limitations. It is a 1-2 day. How do you do on that day? And some people perform better in those situations than others. Internally, we've appointed people sometimes who are appalling at interview, but we just know we've got great practice, and that was backed up by what they did. There's no perfect process for these things. You just have to have one that seems fair and which you can justify who you appoint.
That's great. Yeah, perfect. Sorry if you heard to do a test on the alarm here then. So if you heard anything come through there, Steve, sorry about that. So in regards to, recruiting leaders or even just coming across other leaders within the sector, obviously you'll have a lot of sort of collaboration with other leaders. What do you think, Steve, makes a good leader sort of within a school or a trust? I'm
trying to go back, and I'm kind of framing the last book umpteen times here, but there's something about, in essence, they have a sense of purpose. They know what it is that they tell us the end point of education is. This is what we're aiming to. There's a deep moral purpose to them. So, issues of admission and making sure they try to admit widely, including disadvantaged pupils, those who maybe have special needs, and also inclusion, keeping them in the school and doing good by them. So there's that sense of purpose. They have a strong knowledge around important aspects of education, and they're able to link the purpose to the knowledge. So I often talk curriculum is purpose enacted. So when you know your purpose, your curriculum reflects it. And they kind of have that kind of an enhanced knowledge of various areas. And they also have ways of working as leaders, and they make things happen. They're good at putting things in place and working with other people. So they have this variety of things, and not everything has to be fully formed when you accept the job. In fact, the reality is most of what I learned, say about anything finance, HR, premises, I learned whilst I was ahead. So what I knew about, remember, £30 million public money in excess over the time I was a head CEO. What I knew about premises when I started headship, you literally could write on the back of a postage stamp.
Yeah,
I knew next to nothing. I knew that we had a premises, who owned it, very, really basic stuff. But I did various things. First of all, the school needed somebody to work on premises, so I improved my knowledge. The other thing is, we appointed within a premises manager who took over a lot of the work of the everyday, so I didn't have to worry about. So he said, Steve, where's your planned preventative maintenance scheme? I don't know, Andrew. I don't know what a planned preventative maintenance scheme is. Talk me through and I'll tell you whether we've got one. Right, we ain't got one. All right, I'll put one in. So we'd had this kind of way of looking and checking. He just get compliance things. There was things he checked weekly, things he checked monthly, things he checked annually, and got his team to do, so that we weren't dealing with breakdowns. We were just making sure that the maintenance was planned. And so not everything will you know when you walk into the job, and that's okay. Nobody ever did. But you've got to have a sense of this kind of the purpose and how it could be implemented, a moral purpose, and an ability to reflect on the knowledge you've got on the way that you do things that enable you to get better.
That's interesting. And in terms of sourcing good talent, did you ever find it difficult as an executive head teacher in terms of a CEO of a trust? And obviously you've done some internal recruitment, so you've almost put the work in already if somebody's taken a post internally. But in terms of external candidates, did you ever find there was any challenges to finding good leadership talent, or any nuances that you found were an obstacle?
Yeah, I mean, massively within the faith sector, and Catholic sector includes that, is certainly when you get to deputy and headship, you'd have to be within the Catholic system, a practicing Catholic and a parish priest supporting that. Well, you only have to go to Mass on a Sunday and look at the age profile of the population. There's not a lot of the working population there. Yeah. So you already narrowed it down. So what you find and have found for a decade or two is the jobs which are most advertised tend to be within the faith sector, particularly Catholic sector.
Yeah.
So that automatically creates issues for it in terms of deputies and headships. That's a big block. But the other thing is, working in Blackpool, which is a hugely disadvantaged area, quite rightly, many people would think, right, that's quite a tough gig. Deputy headship is hard enough without actually putting massive layers of disadvantage on top of it. And so getting people into Blackpool, which is often always described as kind of the basket case. If somebody wants to give a place a kicking, Blackpool often appears as the place to give a kicking to. So it puts people off as well. And so that's part of the reason I got involved in things like social media and getting out there and talking at conferences. Say, look, Blackpool's a great place to work. Yep, he'll challenge you, but that's great. That's really great. You'll be tested. And Jill often talks about, kind of your best sailors, found themselves in storms. It's where you test your skill.
Yeah.
And so that becomes an important aspect of what we were trying to present. This will ground you. This will really challenge you. It'll be great. You'll be able to do anything from here. But those were the challenges, really, alongside everything that everybody else is coping with, which is just a shortage of numbers.
And it's quite interesting, but it sort of almost answers my next question around becoming an employer of choice and that sort of almost brand management now of schools and academy trusts, because as we know, there's more and more multi-academy trusts now saturating geographical areas, let's say, and it's almost like a tug of war over securing the best leader because there's so many options potentially out there. How would you advise anyone hiring leadership talent to be an employer of choice? You sort of alluded to some things you were doing there in terms of talks, social media. How important is it that trust do that in terms of branding themselves well? But what are the best ways of doing that as well, in your opinion?
There's two things here. That kind of work, social media, going out and talking, is the messaging. Underneath it has to be the substance. And it's the substance which is important to get right first. Otherwise, people are going to come and say, that's a fraud.
Yeah.
At that, but that doesn't match. And so, if you're looking at things, workload is the issue. But when you look at workload, you have to start digging back and going what described as upstream. What drives workload? And a lot of it is accountability systems, which are just madness. So a dead simple example, 2014, performance-related pay was coming in. So annual performance-related pay. So there was a performance review every year, and depending on the performance review, teachers either got a pay increase or they didn't. That's deeply problematic in lots of ways for me. And so I worked with a group of staff, including some union representatives, and said, okay, what should it look like here? And what they came up with, or we came up with together, is basically there'd be 3 years of automatic progression. Then we'd have a performance review based upon 3 years of work. Otherwise, you're going to have teachers avoiding the most difficult classes.
Yeah.
Why would you take the most difficult class if results aren't great and then somebody says you can't have a pay increase? Particularly early on in your career, when actually money is likely to be really tight. Because, if you think about you want to buy a house and, now with the inflation costs, you're on the lowest wage. And then if you went through the performance review, following 3 years. So if people were coming to our trust, instead of annual performance pay, they knew that they'd get pay for 3 years and then have a review based upon 3 years' work, which seemed really fair and kind of would bring in a lot of different things. And people were kind of very much of the mind, well, if you haven't got evidence after 3 years of the kind of the impact that you're doing and the quality of your work, then maybe you need to be thinking a bit more about it. But in the end, what we found is that performance review after 3 years was a waste of space. We just went for automatic pay progression.
Yeah.
Now we've taken pay off the table, let's really focus on making you a great teacher or a great leader. Now, where's the professional development? So there's something around now, we've got rid of pointless accountability because it's so hard to ascribe to individual teachers the success of a child. So when a pupil's got a good GCSE, say after I taught them for 2 years chemistry, what about the teacher who taught them for 3 years at Q Stage 3? Or the early years teacher who taught them to write, or who can kind of take credit for that? So all that problematic, but then we focus on professional development. So you've got some really good things going on in professional development where we gave people individual time, so time off timetable, reduce the timetable load. So that was another positive. We did collective planning. So we planned schemes of work collectively so that people weren't on their own doing the work. And that goes back as well to getting all the experience in the room. So it's about developing the substance of what the message will be. And there you need some real clarity about, okay, what is it that's the problem? Not just the symptoms, workload, what sits behind that, including schools trying to do too many things. Right, okay, let's do a fewer things better. And there's always work which is seen as good work and work which is seen as bad work, that kind of the unproductive administration gone mad. There's a basic amount of administration that you have to get right. Even taking register, you've got to get your register right. But layers upon top of that can sometimes be too much. So how do you strip that out? And that was always a challenge because there's just so many demands coming at you. But just focus on making this a great place to work and then getting that message out.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. And just our final section of these talks, Stephen, we always ask for 5 top tips, I suppose, for anyone that's maybe going into leadership, considering that, or might have just gone into a leadership position. And we always ask our guests to provide, not necessarily 5, but if you've got 5, perfect. But just any key top tips for anyone that's considering leadership or already in a leadership position within education.
The one I always start with is know thyself. So people have heard me talk, will have heard the phrase, you bring who you are to leadership. So you bring Steve, I bring Steve into, we bring the person who we are. So do you know who you are as a leader? And quite often the challenges of becoming a better leader are becoming a better person first. So I tend to kind of like be quite impatient, and I know I'm quite impatient. And there's sometimes that impatience can be really valuable. We've got to move quickly on this. That's a very easy place for me. There's other times when people need the opportunity to think, to reflect, to bring back different perspectives, ideas, to think, and it's a much more what I describe gentle, more organic approach, which I always find challenging because I have to sit on my hands. Early on in leadership, I probably didn't realize that enough. Later on, I could. And so then I could start discerning, where might we need to move quickly? Where might we not? So do you know who you are? Do you know the person that you are? And if you like, what are the things that you do well and you might want to make super strengths? And what are the things that maybe you aren't so good at? And do any of them, I describe it as hold you below the waterline. So do any of them continually undermine you as a leader? And you've got to deal with those as well. So that in the book I talk about introspection. It's that ability to see yourself, and it's out of love and with love. You want to you do it out of love. You want to be the best person you can, and you do it with love because actually it can be quite if you're going to be really honest with yourself, it can be quite a bruising process. So that know thyself. I think you need to be fascinated by curriculum, teaching, learning, children, young people, and the development, staff development. You need to be fascinated by the actual, if you like, education area that you're within. That needs to fascinate you, and you need to keep on learning because that's the major discourse of the organisation. That's the conversation that's going on. And I need to be able to go in and to chat curriculum and teaching and learning with people. I need to listen to what they're saying, give different perspectives or reinforce perspectives that they might have. I need to, as the head teacher, be the person who is helping teach and develop the staff. And that requires a depth of knowledge, including realizing that maybe your own phase or subject knowledge doesn't apply everywhere. So it's how do you create space for the people to come in? I kind of say learn from experience on the basis it's a good teacher. But be careful what you attribute your successes and failures to. So there's a very dangerous line that you can go down where you do something, there's a positive outcome and you automatically say, oh, it's because I did this. And then actually it's because I did, and it's all becomes I. And then before you know it, there's a sense of you've gone beyond empowerment to entitlement to kind of arrogance and hubris, that it's all about me. And that takes you to the wrong place as a leader. And so that kind of humility and legacy, they talk about sweeping the sheds, about, okay, let me learn from the experiences, positive and maybe not so positive, and just careful what I attribute to. And then the final one is, and this was kind of I talk about 3 phases of headship, was a massive growth for me. Understand leadership as a team game. So I kind of you start with my leadership. What can I do? What can I help enhance? And then you move to our leadership, the kind of the wisdom of the antle, as they call it, the fact that we're stronger together. But then you've got to move beyond our, which might be the school or the trust, to the education system, and that idea of the education of all young people. So being the first to grab, if you like, the newly qualified teachers is kind of great for your organisation. But if there aren't enough newly qualified teacher, or you're one of these sausage machine schools that's churning out teachers who are just leaving the profession, then that's no good for the profession overall. Yeah. And so I kind of go, know yourself, be fascinated, keep learning, including from experience. It's a good teacher, and get into the understanding that leadership is a team game, and the team just keeps getting bigger. Me, the school, the system.
Yeah. Wow. Some amazing tips there. And thank you for those, and just to wrap up, it's to thank you more than anything, really, Stephen, just for spending the time here and sharing the knowledge. Some of what you said will be hugely impactful, I think, for people that are considering leadership, that just work in the school just as a teacher, for people that are currently in leadership positions as well. So I'm sure when this goes out, people will take a listen to it and think, yeah, there's quite a lot there for me to take away. So I would urge people as well, for all our listeners, to dig into what Stephen's done and have a look at his website. We'll provide the link to that. We'll provide the link to his books as well. So definitely have a look at those. And again, it's just to thank you again, Stephen. And for our listeners, thanks for listening to Lessons in Leadership. If you've liked the podcast, don't forget to go to our website, which is www.mlk-search.co.uk. And don't forget, and I'll reiterate this one more time, have a look at Stephen's content. He's got a breadth of knowledge and experience that you can definitely use within your own practice. So thank you again, Steve. Really huge pleasure to have you on, and really enjoyed spending time with you this morning. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.